Hi, I'm Keith Nolan. Welcome to Access All Areas, and I'm here today in Bangkok with legendary writer Jerry Hopkins.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Nice to see you. You started out with the Rolling Stone magazine writing. Tell us about your first biography.
Well, I had been with Rolling Stone for 2.5, 3 years, and one of the things I did during that period was do a Rolling Stone interview with Jim Morrison. I had been drinking in the same bars with him. We were not friends, but we were more than acquaintances. And during the course of my interview with him, he suggested that I write a book about Elvis. It had never occurred to me. I was not an Elvis fan when he first came out in the 50s. But I thought about it and I realized that Elvis had been forgotten and that he represented an amazing earth shift, both socially, culturally, musically, I mean, almost any way you could think. And I also felt that he had been sort of misrepresented or misunderstood in the sense that the image he projected to the public was not who he was really inside. You know, he was, during the 1950s, regarded as a threat worse than communism. The ministers, you know, blacklisted him. Rock and roll was considered a threat. But at the time, he was really a God-fearing, church-going, yes sir, no sir, mom-loving,
good Christian
Southern boy.
Yeah.
Well-mannered. Later, he became very mainstream. He crossed over, became the JC's Young Man of the Year. The highway that ran past Graceland was named for him. He became kind of mainstream, by which time he was getting into drugs and guns and girls and all the rest of it. I mean, he was always sort of not what you saw. And that I found was very true of a lot of rock stars.
Yeah. So sort of his public image was very different to who he was inside and in reality. Or,
you know, fame and money destroy you. You know, an awful lot of rock stars, an awful lot of movie stars, and a lot of other people who became prominent in one field or another ended up, you know.
Jim Morrison said a book about Elvis is something he'd like to read, and that's what inspired the book in the first place.
I was interviewing Jim for Rolling Stone, and I had just published a small history of rock and roll, and he said he'd read it and liked it, and was I writing another book? And I said, well, you know, I'm thinking about doing a biography. It intrigues me as a form, and I was actually thinking about Frank Zappa, because I'd known Zappa from before he was a rock star. And Jim just said simply, I'd like to read a book about Elvis. And when he'd said that, we had just come from his agent's office, which I discovered was my agent as well. And so when I got together a little presentation for the Elvis book, I said it, you know, gave it to my agent. She sent it to Jim's publisher. Jim had gone to the agent to sign a contract for his first poetry book. And that editor at Simon & Schuster took the Elvis book. And then when Jim died, in 1971, several years later, the publisher called me and he said, how'd you like to do a book about Jim? And I said, I've already decided to do one, because not only was I affected more greatly by his death than my relationship warranted, as was the same thing with Elvis. He was, you know, the Doors and Morrison, you know, I mean, they were going to go down in history in flames. Morrison was this jerk who, you know, dropped his pants or didn't in Miami, who, you know, I mean,
rock and roll.
He was a revolutionary too, and he and the Doors changed music and changed the way a lot of people look at things, and became an icon along with Elvis. So it's sort of like I'm the guy self-appointed to go along behind and clean up.
And Jim Morrison was also a poet.
Well, see,
so as a writer, you must have been able to relate.
Jim was perceived as this drunken asshole, which he was. But I mean, that was as far as public perception went. I mean, he was a poet. He considered himself a poet. He considered himself a filmmaker. He had a sense of humor about himself. He was extraordinarily intelligent. He could talk about anything. He'd read everything and remembered it all and put it together in interesting ways. He was not, the way he was portrayed in that movie by Oliver Stone. There was more to him. And I just feel that, rock and roll was not getting any kind of attention in those days of a serious nature.
Jerry, tell me about your meeting with Jimi Hendrix. That was quite an unusual meeting.
I'd seen Jimi Hendrix in performance a couple of times, but I'd never met him. And one day, while I was living in Los Angeles, my wife came home from wherever she was shopping, and she said she had run into this guy who put the moves on her, wanted to and asked her, would you like to meet Jimi Hendrix?
What a line.
And she said, why? And he said, well, he's a friend of mine, and he's in town, he's in Beverly Hills, and I'm going to go over to his room, and would you like to come along? And she said, yes, can my husband come too? He writes for Rolling Stone. Well, the guy was cool enough to, say, cool, yeah. So we went to the hotel, and Jimmy explained that he had a friend coming who he'd been friends with in the Army, who was a bass player, and that he was abandoning, he was giving up, he was ending the trio.
Oh, okay.
And he was going to go into a new kind of music. So I got a story out of it as well. And it was going to be called Sky Music, and it became different personnel, different kind of music and so on. Anyway, at the end of the little interview, he said, my bass player and I are just going to jam for a little while. If you'd like to hang around, please feel free to do so. Well, of course, private concert from Jimi Hendrix, there was nobody else there in the room. And
except the guy that liked your wife.
I left my tape recorder running, and of course the batteries died, and I have no record of that.
That would have been a nice recording to have.
Maybe I have a limited attention span. I'd written about a lot of other things before rock and roll, and and I figured I was going to write about different things. And I also got bored with Hawaii. Hawaii's everybody, which is where I lived at the time, and Hawaii is everybody's idea of paradise. And it is the most beautiful place on earth. It's got the best climate and so on. But every day is just like yesterday, and tomorrow's going to be another one. And so I had by then discovered Southeast Asia, and particularly Thailand, where I knew that if I moved there, I was not too old for another adventure. If I moved there, I would never be bored.
Romance.
I would be, no, well, it wasn't just romance. It was, I love surprise. So one of the reasons I came here, and there were many, the food, the climate, the location, the beautiful women, the nice people, the Buddhism, the benevolent, everything.
Jerry, what are you working on now? What have you got in store for us book-wise?
Well, it's something that's really intrigued me. It's a subject that's really intrigued me for 25 years. Going back to when I lived in Hawaii, and for the 3 years I lived with a transsexual street hooker. And I fell in love with her. And I became absolutely entranced by the transgendered phenomenon, if you will. And when I moved here, I continued to see them, not just in the bars here, but the girls would come from the United States for sex change operations, boob jobs, whatever, and I would be sort of their wingman. I would take them to meet the doctor, whom I got to know, and I knew which bars they wanted to go to, I knew where they wanted to shop, and so forth. And so my fascination with this lifestyle, with this whole thing, continued, and I'm now working on a book that will profile, both photographically and in text, 25 transgendered katoi, as they're known here, sex workers in Thailand. Some of them will be from Laos and Cambodia because they're working here, but most will be homegrown girls who are, as far as I'm concerned, the most interesting and courageous people I've ever encountered in a lifetime of collecting unusual people. I mean, they're not only challenging, you know, who they are, what their sexual identity is, and changing it physically and chemically and in terms of lifestyle. They're also challenging society's ideas about what's acceptable sexual behavior. So I just find them fascinating people.
And Thailand's very tolerant in these. If you decide tomorrow you want to sex change, you want to be a woman, you can.
Well,
And
you know, a
it's
lot
not
of
as frowned
people say, why are there so many lady boys in Thailand? The answer is, or the question should be, why does it appear there are so many lady boys in Thailand? Statistically, proportionately to the population, there aren't any more here than there are anywhere else. The difference is they're all out.
Yes.
You can see them all. Every family's got one. It's not that big a deal. The popular media, and this is the most important part of it, the popular media, the cabaret shows, television, and movies have moved being a lady boy in Thailand into the public acceptance arena. They're just not, you know, so they're all out, and that doesn't mean their life is easy. There's still a lot of problems, but still a lot of discrimination and stigmatization and rules
A ways to go.
running how their lives should be and so on. Who are we is a question we all ask ourselves, you know, but most of us don't have to figure out what our sex is. I mean, can you imagine that? When you think nature made a mistake and you're going to do something about it, that's amazing.
Yes, yes. Well, there's lots of research to be done in Bangkok, that's for sure. So, Jerry Hopkins, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.